I just wanted to ask you to join me today in finding a special place in your hearts and your minds and prayers.
Charles just absolutely stunned the entire UK with an unprecedented live television announcement, finally breaking decades of silence after Princess Diana left her entire estate to one unexpected person. The high-definition cameras caught the frail monarch's hands violently shaking as he held up a frayed envelope sealed with the Spencer family crest, a shadow will that his own Privy Council had spent 25 years threatening to burn. He wasn't addressing his nation, but rather a terrified 32-year-old commoner named Eleanor Thorne, the orphaned daughter of Diana's only loyal security guard, who now legally holds the deeds to the very ground the royal family stands on. The Crown's most ruthless lawyers offered her £40 million in tax-free hush money to disappear. But Eleanor simply tightened her grip on an antique Swiss vault key, demanding the truth about the summer her father and the princess were killed. What horrifying royal secret is locked inside that Geneva vault that forced a reigning monarch to commit financial suicide on live television? And how did one ordinary woman become the sole weapon Princess Diana engineered from the grave to finally bring the institution to its knees? The broadcasting room inside Buckingham Palace felt less like a seat of power and more like a tomb. The air was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the weight of a secret that had been buried for a quarter of a century. At the center of the room, behind a massive mahogany desk scarred by generations of monarchs, sat King Charles III. He wasn't looking at the camera. He wasn't looking at the teleprompter currently scrolling his meticulously vetted, aggressively sanitized speech. His eyes were locked on a single object resting on the green leather blotter, a frayed, slightly yellowed envelope. The seal on the back was cracked red wax, bearing the unmistakable crest of the Spencer family. A few feet away, standing in the shadows of the heavy velvet drapery, his equerry, Arthur, shifted his weight. The faint rustle of Arthur's uniform sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. Charles didn't flinch. "Are the boys watching?" Charles asked, his voice barely more than a gravelly whisper. It wasn't the voice of a king. It was the voice of a father, bracing for an impact he couldn't shield his sons from. "Yes, Your Majesty," Arthur replied softly. "They are watching from Windsor." "But, sir," Arthur hesitated, stepping marginally into the light. "The Privy Council is in an uproar outside these doors. The Prime Minister has called 3 times in the last 10 minutes. They strongly advise you burn that document. Once you read it out loud, the Crown as we know it changes forever." Charles reached out, his weathered fingers lightly tracing the cursive handwriting on the front of the envelope. It was Diana's. The loops of her letters were as elegant and hurried as he remembered. "To be opened on the coronation of my husband or upon my son's 40th birthdays, whichever comes last." He had kept it hidden. For decades, he let the firm's lawyers and the royal spin doctors dictate the narrative. He let the world believe the tragedy was neatly wrapped up in a bow of settlements and public mourning. But the paper under his fingertips pulsed with the undeniable truth of a woman who knew exactly what the institution was capable of. Above the camera lens, a red standby light began to blink. A slow, rhythmic pulse. 10 seconds to air. Every instinct Charles had been bred to obey screamed at him to push the envelope into the desk drawer. To protect the institution. To protect the wealth. To preserve the illusion. But then he remembered a biting wind at a small, largely ignored cemetery weeks before Diana's own death. He remembered a little girl, standing alone, clutching a platinum ring on a silver chain. A girl the firm had utterly erased. 5 seconds. The red light turned solid green. The nation was watching. Millions of eyes across the United Kingdom were glued to their screens, waiting for their king to address the sudden constitutional crisis that had leaked to the press just hours prior. Charles ignored the teleprompter. He picked up the frayed envelope, holding it up so the high-definition lens could catch the fractured red wax seal. "Today," Charles began, his voice trembling before steeling into absolute resolve, "I must speak to you not as your king, but as a man correcting a 25-year-old lie regarding the late Princess of Wales." The broadcast room plunged into absolute terrified silence. 48 hours before that earth-shattering broadcast, the reality of the Crown's vast, untouchable wealth had violently collided with Eleanor Thorne's threadbare existence. Eleanor lived in a damp, two-bedroom terraced house in York, surviving month to month on a junior rare books archivist's salary. Her world was quiet, small, and heavily mortgaged. That illusion of peace shattered the moment three armored, obsidian-black Range Rovers aggressively mounted the curb of her narrow street, their engines idling with a low, menacing growl. When she looked at the men stepping onto her cracked linoleum kitchen floor, their bespoke Savile Row suits radiating an intimidating generational wealth, her mind violently snapped back to a rainy night in 1997. She was 7 years old. Her father, Thomas Thorne, a towering man whose broad shoulders always seemed tense from protecting Princess Diana, had rushed into her room. He hadn't smiled. He had hastily shoved a heavy, cold platinum chain over her head, tucking a strange, perfectly round key beneath her pajama collar. The cinematic memory played in her mind like a horror film. The terror in his eyes, the smell of rain on his coat, the way he whispered, "Never take it off, Elle. Not for the police. Not for the palace." 3 weeks later, his car was forced off a cliff in France. A convenient, tragic accident. The firm paid for a modest, heavily supervised funeral and promptly erased his name from the official royal ledgers. For 25 years, Eleanor had unconsciously rubbed the hidden key through her clothing whenever she felt cornered. Just as she did now, her fingers pressing the cold metal against her collarbone. "Miss Thorne," the lead solicitor, Alistair Sterling, began, his voice dripping with aristocratic condescension as he set a heavily locked leather attaché case on her cheap, scratched dining table. "We represent the Crown Estate. We are prepared to make this entirely painless." "Painless for whom?" Eleanor shot back, her voice tight but unwavering. Alistair snapped the briefcase open. Inside lay thick, banded stacks of bearer bonds and a pristine, legally binding non-disclosure agreement. £40 million, tax-free, cleared into an offshore account by noon today. Eleanor stared at the staggering fortune. It was enough to buy 100 lifetimes of comfort, enough to erase every struggle she had ever known. She looked at the polished Oxford shoes of the men crowding her tiny kitchen. "In exchange for what?" "Your signature on this document," Alistair said, stepping uncomfortably close. "And the immediate surrender of the platinum Swiss vault key your father stole." Sterling's eyes lingered on her neck. He knew the palace's private security detail waiting outside could easily take the chain from her by force, but the banque privée in Geneva was governed by ironclad international protocols. Diana had been a master tactician in her final days. Without Eleanor's verified living signature and biometric presence, the vault would permanently lock, instantly triggering an automated release of its explosive contents to the global press. The most powerful monarchy on earth was completely paralyzed by a dead woman's brilliant legal foresight. "He didn't steal it," Eleanor whispered. She looked at the £40 million, then up at the men whose employers had discarded her father like trash to protect their reputation. A dangerous, intoxicating spark of curiosity ignited in her chest, overriding her fear. She closed the briefcase with a sharp snap. "Keep your money. I want to know what my father died protecting." Alistair Sterling's polite facade vanished instantly, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate sneer. He lunged forward, reaching directly for the platinum chain around Eleanor's neck. But before his fingers could graze her collarbone, a heavy, gloved hand clamped violently down on his wrist. A man in a dark trench coat, who had silently slipped through her unlocked back door, twisted Sterling's arm back. The man flashed a Royal Protection Command badge, but it bore a different, highly distinct insignia, not the King's, but the Prince of Wales's. Sterling's face drained of color as the officer silently shook his head, a clear threat from a rival royal faction. Eleanor didn't wait to understand why Prince William's private detail was suddenly intervening to protect her. She grabbed her coat and bolted into the rain. As she rushed through the York train station hours later, she found a cheap burner phone slipped into her pocket, glowing with a single, untraceable message. "They will freeze your passport by midnight. Go to Geneva now. W." The flight to Switzerland was a suffocating blur of adrenaline and paranoia. Every businessman in first class felt like an assassin. Every bump of turbulence felt like a trap. By the time Eleanor stood beneath the imposing, vaulted marble ceilings of the Banque Privée, her hands were trembling so violently she could barely hold her father's key. The bank manager, a stoic Swiss official who looked as though he had been expecting her for a quarter of a century, led her deep into the subterranean bedrock. "Your father was a profoundly cautious man, Miss Thorne," the manager noted, his voice echoing off the cold steel walls. "He mandated an extreme dual verification, the physical key and a biometric blood draw match to his direct lineage. Had the firm's men taken this key by force, the vault was rigged to incinerate its contents instantly." Eleanor winced as an automated medical scanner pricked her finger. She slid the heavy platinum key into the brass slot. A deep hydraulic hiss broke the silence as the massive, blast-proof steel door swung heavily open. Inside the sterile, climate-controlled box wasn't gold, nor was it a pile of stolen royal jewels. It was a single, fragile legal folio, heavily stamped with the sovereign seal of the International Court of Justice. Eleanor carefully unfolded the thick parchment. The handwriting was frantic, elegant, and instantly recognizable. It was a superseding will, a shadow codicil, drafted by Princess Diana, mere days before the fatal crash in Paris. Eleanor's eyes scanned the complex legal jargon, her breath catching painfully in her throat. Diana had always known the royal family's lawyers would relentlessly control her official UK estate to keep her sons financially dependent on the firm. So, operating in absolute secrecy, she had quietly leveraged her vast aristocratic Spencer wealth, systematically purchasing the ancient, foundational land leases that the Duchy of Cornwall, the monarchy's primary source of wealth and power, was built upon, burying them in this untouchable Swiss trust. "My true estate," Eleanor read aloud, the words blurring through sudden hot tears as the emotional weight of a dead mother's desperation washed over her. "I leave entirely to Thomas Thorne, and upon his death, his bloodline. Thomas was the only man who did not betray me. Use this leverage, Eleanor, to free my boys when the time is right." Eleanor dropped the paper, the horrifying magnitude of her father's death finally snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. He hadn't been killed over a rumor or a paparazzi chase. He had been murdered because he was legally the landlord of the British Crown. And now, she was. Suddenly, the burner phone in her pocket vibrated, loudly shattering the vault's silence with an incoming call from a secure London number. Eleanor hesitated, staring at the burner phone vibrating aggressively against the cold steel of the vault. The screen displayed no caller ID, only a scrambled sequence of international routing numbers. Her thumb hovered over the accept button. If she answered, the Crown would instantly geolocate her exact position within the bank. If she didn't, the terrifying leverage she now held would remain frozen in a standoff she lacked the resources to survive. She pressed the green icon, raising the plastic device to her ear. A thick, oppressive silence hung on the line before a voice spoke, not the aggressive bark of a solicitor, but the weary, trembling rasp of an old man cornered by his own legacy. It was King Charles. 800 miles away in London, the opulent crimson walls of the king's private study felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. Outside the reinforced doors, the palace was descending into absolute chaos. The head of the Privy Council, a ruthless political operator with generations of inherited aristocratic arrogance, had just slammed a thick dossier onto Charles's desk. The strategy was brutal and efficient. They would immediately freeze Eleanor's passport, lock her assets in a shadow injunction, and drag her through international litigation for decades until her legal funds completely evaporated. They would crush her quietly, burying the scandal beneath layers of state security protocols, ensuring the public never even knew a commoner briefly held the financial leash of the British monarchy. Charles turned his back to the shouting men, staring out the rain-streaked window at the sprawling, manicured lawns of his empire. The cold glass mirrored the deep, exhausted lines of his face, violently pulling his mind back to a haunting, visceral memory he had suppressed for decades. The cinematic sequence played relentlessly behind his eyes, the overwhelming smell of lilies in Westminster Abbey, the paralyzing, suffocating weight of the crown's expectations as he stood over Diana's closed casket, and the agonizing realization of how the institution systematically destroyed anyone who defied its survival. Most vividly, he remembered looking out through the tinted glass of his limousine at a secondary, largely ignored funeral later that week, watching a drenched, shivering 7-year-old Eleanor Thorne standing completely alone over her father's grave. The acidic, rot-like guilt of abandoning that child to protect his own ascension had eaten at his soul like a slow poison. "Your Majesty," Arthur, the royal equerry, interrupted softly, stepping past the screaming lawyers with a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. "Miss Thorne is on the line. She says she has read the Codicil." Charles snatched the receiver, his knuckles turning white. The room fell into a deathly, suspended silence. "Eleanor," Charles breathed, the sheer vulnerability in his tone shocking the hardened advisors in the room. "The men behind me are preparing to destroy your life to protect this institution. Tell me what you want. Name your price." "I don't want your money," Eleanor's voice echoed through the speaker, devoid of fear, hardened by the undeniable truth of her father's sacrifice. "I want the world to know what she really left behind. Not wealth, but a way out of the machine. If you bury this, you bury her again." The line went dead, leaving a dial tone that sounded like a flatlining heartbeat. Charles slowly lowered the phone, looking at the ruthless men perfectly willing to murder an innocent woman's future to secure his throne. He picked up his heavy fountain pen, twisting the gold cap. "Call the BBC," Charles ordered, his eyes locking onto the terrified equerry. "Set up the broadcast room immediately." The moment the order left Charles's lips, the velvet-lined study erupted into a theater of absolute, venomous panic. Lord Kensington, the head of the Privy Council, a man whose ruthless lineage had manipulated the crown from the shadows since the reign of Victoria, slammed his manicured hands onto the king's mahogany desk. "You cannot do this, Charles," Kensington roared, completely abandoning all aristocratic protocol. "If you legitimize that codicil on public television, the Duchy of Cornwall collapses. The monarchy goes bankrupt. We will cut the palace feed. We will invoke the Regency Act and declare you mentally unfit before you ever reach those cameras." Kensington wasn't bluffing. Charles knew the dark, labyrinthine history of the firm. They had locked away royals in hidden sanitariums for far less than dismantling the sovereign's wealth. The king stood momentarily frozen, the crippling, lifelong weight of his institutional conditioning paralyzing his limbs. For a terrifying, suffocating second, it seemed the old guard had won. Then, the heavy oak doors of the study violently burst open. It wasn't the palace guard coming to sedate the king. Prince William strode into the room, his jaw set like granite, flanked by 4 heavily armed, fiercely loyal officers from his personal protection detail. The heir to the throne didn't look at the screaming politicians. His piercing gaze locked directly onto his father. The oppressive tension in the room snapped taut. William's mind vividly flashed back to a bitterly cold morning 2 years prior, deep within the restricted, dust-choked archives of Kensington Palace. He had uncovered a heavily redacted, unauthorized financial ledger detailing unexplained, massive transfers from his mother's private Spencer accounts just days before her fatal crash in Paris. It had taken him years of quietly defying the firm's watchful eyes to trace that phantom money to Geneva, and ultimately to Thomas Thorne's erased orphan daughter. William had spent his entire adult life smiling for the cameras, waving from balconies, while secretly engineering a brutal, calculated war against the very institution he was born to rule, waiting in the shadows for the exact moment to spring his mother's final, devastating trap. The BBC feed is locked, secured, and broadcasting directly to a global satellite network, William stated, his voice a chilling, precise weapon that instantly silenced the screaming room. He stepped deliberately between Kensington and the king. Anyone who attempts to sever that connection will be immediately arrested for high treason. Kensington's face flushed a violent, apoplectic purple. "You are destroying your own inheritance, Your Royal Highness. She is a commoner. You are handing the absolute power of the monarchy to a ghost." "No," William replied softly, the devastating, raw emotional weight of 25 years of suppressed grief suddenly breaking through his rigid royal facade. "I am finally burying my mother properly." William gently placed a hand on his father's trembling shoulder, bridging a vast chasm of generational resentment in a single, silent gesture of unified defiance. Charles nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and began the long, agonizing walk down the gilded corridor toward the broadcast room. But back in Switzerland, thousands of miles away, the fragile victory shattered. Eleanor's burner phone vibrated violently a second time, not with a call, but with a terrifying, blaring automated alert from the Geneva Vault's internal security mainframe. The heavy, blast-proof steel door of the subterranean vault was groaning, slowly pivoting shut on its massive hydraulic hinges, and the electronic emergency keypad on the inside had just gone completely dead. The bank manager had vanished. Someone deeply embedded within the Swiss bank had just overridden the system to manually trigger the vault's incinerator protocol with Eleanor still trapped inside. The heavy, blast-proof steel door slammed shut with an earth-shattering boom that vibrated deep in Eleanor's teeth, instantly plunging the subterranean vault into a terrifying, blood-red emergency glow. Above her, a brutal mechanical hiss signaled the activation of the incinerator protocol, designed to flood the chamber with superheated gas to destroy compromised assets. The air immediately thickened, growing painfully hot in her lungs. Eleanor lunged at the thick steel door, hammering her fists against the cold metal until her knuckles bled, but the digital keypad was entirely dead. The firm had reached the bank manager, leveraging their limitless geopolitical power to turn Princess Diana's impenetrable fortress into Eleanor's tomb. Sliding down the unyielding door, Eleanor clutched the fragile parchment of the shadow codicil to her chest. She closed her eyes, the terrifying reality setting in that she was about to be erased in the exact same brutal, undocumented manner as her father. But as the platinum key swung on its chain, hitting her collarbone, the cinematic fog of terror parted, making way for a razor-sharp memory from the week before her father's murder. She saw Thomas Thorne sitting on the edge of her childhood bed, holding that very key up to the light. He had pointed to a microscopic, almost invisible groove milled into the shaft of the platinum. He wasn't just a security guard. He was a master tactical engineer who never trusted electronic systems. "The firm relies on computers, Elle," His deep voice echoed vividly in her mind, heavy with an eerie premonition. But a man who builds a cage must always hide a mechanical key. Never trust a door that only opens with a code. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. The automated voice blared a chilling 30-second countdown. The temperature was now blistering. She dropped to her knees, frantically running her bleeding fingers along the steel paneling beneath the dead electronic keypad until she felt it. A tiny, physical slot perfectly matching the groove on her father's key. She jammed the platinum metal in and violently twisted. A massive analog gear ground against the silence, and a heavy maintenance hatch violently kicked open at the base of the wall, revealing a narrow, pitch-black ventilation shaft. Eleanor scrambled into the suffocatingly tight duct, dragging the codicil behind her just as a blinding, white-hot flash of fire consumed the main vault, melting the walls into slag. Simultaneously, back in London, the suffocating tension in the Buckingham Palace broadcast room reached its absolute peak. King Charles stared straight into the lens as the camera's standby light shifted to a solid, unforgiving green. He opened his mouth, ready to detonate the ultimate truth. But just outside the camera's frame, Lord Kensington's encrypted phone buzzed. The ruthless politician glanced at the screen, and a chilling, victorious smile spread across his face. He stepped forward, raising a hand to signal the producer. "Speak your truth, Your Majesty," Kensington whispered loud enough for Charles to hear, holding up his phone screen displaying a single message. "Vault incinerated. Threat neutralized. But the girl is dead. The paper is ashes. And if you say a word now, you will look like a madman inventing ghosts." The crushing weight of Lord Kensington's whispered words hit Charles like a physical blow. The fractured red wax seal on the envelope in front of him suddenly felt like a monument to a hollow victory. If Eleanor was truly dead, if the original superseding will was nothing but ash in a Swiss vault, the firm's ruthless legal team would effortlessly tear him apart. The public would not see a brave monarch righting a historic wrong. They would see a grieving, delusional king suffering from a catastrophic breakdown on live television. The broadcast camera's green light bored into him, cold, unblinking, and hungry. The entire nation was holding its breath. Kensington's victorious, venomous smirk widened as he stepped back into the shadows of the velvet drapery, completely assured that the monarchy's dark, violent machine had won yet again. Charles opened his mouth, the prepared, heavily sanitized lie resting bitterly on his tongue. But before he could utter a single word of surrender, a deafening commotion erupted from the control booth behind the camera crew. "Switch the auxiliary monitor, now." Prince William's voice roared over the headsets, shattering the broadcast room's suffocating silence. On the massive digital display mounted to the right of the BBC camera, a breaking news feed from an independent Swiss journalistic network violently interrupted the scheduled broadcast. The shaky, chaotic footage showed the exterior of the Banque Privée in Geneva, thick black smoke billowing from its subterranean street vents. And there, emerging from a soot-stained service grate in the alleyway, completely surrounded by aggressive Swiss federal police securing the perimeter, was Eleanor Thorne. She was covered in ash, her hands bleeding profusely, but she was standing, and clutched fiercely against her chest, shielded from the chaos by her torn coat, was the undamaged legal folio of the shadow codicil. William had never trusted the firm's reach into foreign banking. He had anonymously tipped off the Swiss federal authorities regarding a potential international terrorism threat at the exact coordinates of the vault 30 minutes prior, ensuring heavily armed, independent witnesses were swarming the location the precise moment the firm's assassins triggered the fire. Kensington's face drained of all blood, the encrypted phone slipping from his manicured fingers and clattering loudly onto the marble floor. The trap had failed. The ghost had survived. Charles looked at the monitor, a profound, overwhelming surge of absolute clarity, washing away 25 years of institutional cowardice. He turned back to the camera, his eyes burning with a terrifying, righteous authority he had never truly possessed until this exact moment. For 25 years, King Charles spoke directly into the lens, his voice finally steady, echoing with a devastating finality. The world believed Princess Diana's estate was settled. It was not. She left a final directive, a shadow estate, left entirely to one person, a woman named Eleanor Thorne, the orphaned daughter of a man who showed Diana the loyalty my own family failed to provide. A collective, echoing gasp ripped through pubs, living rooms, and streets across the United Kingdom. This estate, Charles continued, stacking the frayed envelope neatly on his desk, sealing the fate of his own empire, includes the historical, foundational leases to the very lands the crown relies upon. By law, the royal family's financial independence now belongs to Miss Thorne. Effective midnight, the crown will not contest the Codicil. We will pay rent to the Thorne estate, which will be funneled directly into a sovereign charity for victims of institutional abuse. Charles looked up from the desk, meeting his son's unwavering gaze across the silent, stunned room. William nodded deeply, a silent, powerful acknowledgement between two kings, one seated, one waiting in the wings. God save the legacy of the Princess of Wales, Charles whispered. The BBC feed cut to black. The monarchy was forever changed, brought to its knees not by an army or a revolution, but by a hidden mechanical key, an unyielding daughter, and a king who finally chose the truth over the crown.